Well, it would be good to hear a little from a person who can't be here. He was an American intelligence operative by the name of Edgar Poe, sometimes mistakenly referred to as Edgar Allan Poe. He wrote a story called The Mask of the Red Death, or The Masquerade of the Red Death. And that story begins by his saying, the Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal. The redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness. And then the person experienced dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body and especially upon the face of the victor were the pest band that shut him out from the aid and the sympathy of his fellow men. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the instants of half an hour. We're told something about something going on in West Africa. It's referred to as an Ebola virus. It's not news to people who've been following these sorts of things for many, many years. Since 1976, its virulence and its fatality and its finality and its hideousness and its horror has been known. Since 2000, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States has written about the fact that they were aware that between 1973 and 2000, over 30 new diseases had emerged in the world that they thought that the United States had to have a concern about. Their report, just a quote from it, January 2000, stated, at least 30 previously unknown disease agents have been identified since 1973, including HIV, Ebola, hepatitis C, and Nipah virus, for which no cures are available. That's a quote from their report. Now, Matthew unintentionally but accurately stated that I had been a founding member of the Schiller Institute for 40 years. Now, the Schiller Institute has only existed for 30, but that's actually an accurate statement. The reason it's accurate is that 10 years earlier, in 1974, the Executive Intelligence Review magazine was born. We've given you some copies which we'll be referring to of that magazine as we go along. And it's important to say something about the actuality of what is happening in West Africa, which you can't know unless you know what was happening 40 years ago. What is being represented to you as occurring as though it were some sort of inevitable occurrence is an occurrence by design, by intention, and with malice. Malice aforethought. I want to refer here, for people to sort of just know, to a couple of individuals, one of whom you may be more familiar with, his brother, Julian Huxley. Julian Huxley, whose brother was Aldous Huxley, was an author, both of them British, was the founder and the creator, actually, of the United Nations Educational, Social, and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO. It's not well known that between the years 1937 and 1944, note the years, he was also the head of the British Eugenics Society. He stated in 1946 quote, "Even though it is quite true that radical eugenic policy will be for many years politically and psychologically impossible, it will be important for UNESCO to see that the eugenic problem is examined with the greatest care and that the public mind is informed of the issues at stake so that much that now is unthinkable may at least become thinkable." It's 1946. Why is that significant? Well, for many reasons, which also have to do with the counterculture of the 1960s, which we will not take a long time to digress into here, because we're only going to basically create a sort of establishment presentation, and then at the point that you're ready to ask questions, where we'll go into that. In 1974, Helga LaRouche intervened at a conference, a United Nations conference, on world population. This happened in Bucharest, Romania. There's a paragraph I'd like to refer to, which was written by the person who at that time was heading the American Association for the Advancement of Science and was at that conference. And this person stated, "At Bucharest, it was affirmed that continuing unrestricted worldwide population growth can negate any socio-economic gains and fatally imperil the environment. The earlier extreme views that social and economic justice alone can somehow offset population increase, and that the mere provision of contraception can sufficiently reduce population were defeated." Let's go back to this. The earlier extreme views that social and economic justice alone can somehow offset population increase. What she's referring to is an intervention made at that conference by Helga LaRouche against her, that being Margaret Mead, the famous anthropologist Margaret Mead, who was at that time the president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and against whom we directed almost our entire force of intervention, not because of her, but because of what was actually being discussed at that conference. Now, to understand the year 1974, it's important to understand a few things that were going on at that time. There was a man by the name of Robert McNamara. He had become very famous, or infamous, particularly here in Canada, as well as in the United States, because of the Vietnam War. And back in that time, for those of you that might go back that far, you may remember that Montreal in particular, also Toronto, were meccas for, some might say Medinas for, draft dodgers, people from the United States who were either conscientious objectors or whatever, and they were up here. And I know because I was up here at one point, not because I was dodging the draft, because of my own interest in, shall we say, all things countercultural back in 1970-71. Robert McNamara was a term you used to more or less describe the same thing that today you'd think about as with Dick Cheney. You know, you use the word Dick Cheney, everybody knows what you mean. It's almost a term itself that expresses a certain sort of sociopath. So Robert McNamara was the Carlin sociopath of 1970. But many of you may now be thinking, as I say that, wait, you mean Robert McNamara that then denounced what he did in Vietnam and the famous, you know, in retrospect, which he did? And we're not saying that there wasn't, in fact, something real about that. But I want to tell you what Robert McNamara went on to do after Vietnam. Because what he never denounced was what he did at the World Bank in the summer of 1974. Yes, we're talking 40 years ago. And why we're on this 40 years issue, you're going to see as we go along. It has biblical as well as chronological significance. But the relevant element here is this. Robert McNamara was the head of the World Bank. What he did in 1974 was he created a map. And on this map, he created something called the Fourth World. Now, for those too young to know about this, there was this idea of a division of the globe between the first world, which was the world of NATO, which used to actually be in the North Atlantic as opposed to the Black Sea. Because there used to be something called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which meant the Atlantic Ocean. Didn't mean the Caspian Sea or the Black Sea. So that was the first world. Then there was the second world, and that was communism. Some people call it godless communism, but it was communism. It was Russia and Great China. And of course there was Cuba, but Cuba hadn't yet happened when the designation first happened. Then there was the third world, the non-aligned nations. You were not aligned with either of these two blocks. And this was created at a conference in April of 1955 in Bandung, Indonesia, when a group of nations stood up and they decided that they were going to not be aligned politically with either the first or second, and therefore they were called the third world. Well, Robert McNamara created something called the fourth world. The fourth world were 1 billion people who were slated to die. How did he do this? Well, what their point was that any investment of development aid into these countries by World Bank or related institutions was essentially a zero-sum game. That nothing that you did was actually going to improve the conditions in these areas because there were just too many people. And they were going to use too many resources. And what they did was create a map called the Fourth World, in which they slated 1 billion people to die. Well, we didn't approve of that. And we went on a campaign which was referred to as Operation Nuremberg. What that meant was, what we did was we who had read Chief Justice Jackson's evaluations at Nuremberg during the 1947-48 trials recognized that what we were dealing with was a conscious, willful intent using economic policy to commit what we were referring to as not merely genocide. We went on to say, and we created a force to investigate this. That what would be created was an ecological holocaust. We formed a task force, which was called the Ecological Holocaust Task Force, because our notions of economy were notions of physical economy. And we recognized that there is no such thing as economic processes that go on independent of nature. That when you have advanced industrial economies, these are not independent of and separate from natural processes that go on within the biosphere, and which are being self-transformed by that biosphere. We knew that. So we knew that actually what would happen is if you tried to carry out what McNamara was talking about, you would end up with a general ecological degradation of the planet as a whole. Because what would happen is that once you imposed that form of poverty or impoverishment by withdrawing any forms of aid, it meant diseases would do what they should do. See, viruses and bacteria and so on operate according to the laws of physical economy. They don't operate according to the laws of Adam Smith. And they could care less about any form of New Age economics or market analysis or derivatives functions whatsoever. What they do is that they propagate. They propagate, and that is what all things which are biological are designed to do. And in the case of human beings, they go beyond that, but they're also supposed to do that. So procreation, population growth is something that all species do. So if you began the process of reducing the globe's population, our contention from the Ecological Task Force was you were also creating an ecological disconnect of a completely different type than the environmentalists at that time were saying. We said, oh no, there will be an ecological degradation, but the form in which it will manifest itself will be new strains of disease completely unheard of that will be mutated within populations that are being impoverished in this way. All right. Now, a lot of other things can be said about 1974. A lot of things happened that year. Here's something else that happened. which was never acknowledged until 1980 and then finally actually fully declassified in 1991. The Central Intelligence Agency at that time issued a report which was classified. It was called National Security Study Memorandum 200. You can go online right now and get the PDF of this entire document. It's also called Implications for Worldwide Population Growth for U.S. Security Interests. In fact, make sure I have that title precisely exact. So let's go back here, and because I left the word out. Implications of worldwide population growth for U.S. security and overseas interests. Okay. Well, what this is, it names basically 15 nations that have populations that are just like too big. Mexico, Nigeria, Brazil, several are named. And what it does is it outlines that the United States is going to begin a series of policy initiatives to control resource use among these populations, and is going to secure the access to resources, specifically and especially in the African continent, but it actually covers many other areas of the world. And that was 1974. George Bush at the time, George Herbert Walker Bush, or Bush 41 as he's sometimes called in the United States, was then head of the CIA. At that point that this report was written, and Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State. The report is sometimes also called, referred to as the Kissinger Report. That's 74, 40 years ago. When Helga LaRouche got up and started denouncing the people at the Bucharest conference for being equivalent to the Nuremberg criminals that were hanged, the Nazis that were hanged in Nuremberg, Margaret Mead chased her around the conference center with her cane. Margaret Mead had a big, like staff about this big, and she was chasing her around the room with her cane. It's one of Helga's fondest memories. Because what happened to us was that we declared war against these people who we knew were playing a game for a completely different reason. But they were successfully hoodwinking people into believing something. That today, for example, we're being told all over the media concerning this Ebola question. There are many games being played there. I'm not going to try to spend a lot of time on the games, but I do want to simply give us sort of a sense of something here. In a moment, I'm going to ask Bob Hux to tell you about something, or in the context, it will be in the course of things. Bob is one of our members, and he has been in touch with several scientists, physicists in particular, who work in the nuclear technology field. But I want to tell you a story about that, which is relevant here. November 28th of 1974, an organization was formed that a lot of the people from the LaRouche organization were present at the creation of. It was called the Fusion Energy Foundation. And this Fusion Energy Foundation was formed for the purpose of, at that time, creating a crash program for the development of controlled thermonuclear fusion power. Now, some people know what that is. I'll try to do this quickly. It's what powers the sun. People talk about solar energy. Well, if you ever try to analyze what that is, that's thermonuclear fusion. That's what goes on in the sun. And what happens, you have, it's a plasma process. And what has been happening over the course of even the last 4 decades is that these processes have been brought to Earth. We now have the ability and regularly create thermonuclear reactions on Earth that are 12 to 15 times hotter than what you find on the sun. We can do that, and we do it fairly regularly. Containing these, deploying them for commercial purposes is a different matter. But what's relevant is that this is not fossil fuel based. Interestingly, for people who might go back and might look at some of our documents, you can find a document from us from 1975, April of 1975. It's called How the International Development Bank Would Work. The International Development Bank was an idea which was counterposed to McNamara's World Bank. But in that document, I think it's on page 20, but I'm not certain of that, we have a discussion about what we call controlled thermonuclear reactions. And it will be interesting to some of our members to look back at that, because actually at that time, when we write that document, even we are opposed to nuclear fission. Interesting. Because, you know, of course, today, you talk to any of us, you would say, well, no, we're not opposed to it. But in that document, what LaRouche writes is, there is no way to replenish or to repay Africa, South America, or Asia for the looting processes that have gone on over the period of the 40s, 50s, 60s, and during the period of the 20th century and earlier under colonialism. You can't do it by a price arrangement. You can't calibrate your, quote, reparations to these countries by trying to figure out some arithmetic, evaluative means of designating that cocoa or cotton or something else will carry some value inclusive of reparations for this process. You can't do it. So the only thing you can do is you can advance the globe as a whole to forms of energy throughput and energy production, which don't in any way rely on fossil-based fuels. And when you do that, what happens is that your pollution problems effectively disappear because you're no longer using fossil fuels and you no longer have that problem of pollution from that. In the case of thermonuclear fusion, this is a deuterium or deuterium-tritium based process, at least insofar as we have developed it now, and then the waste product from that is water. And it's also the case that the resources for fusion are inexhaustible, including in an absolute sense for our use of the power sources. Again, we'll say more about that in a moment. So Fusion Energy Foundation got created in November. It was 40 years ago, this November 28th. And at that time, those of us who were there remember, the idea was that controlled thermonuclear fusion was 40 years away. So we were saying, wait a minute, it doesn't have to be 40 years away. Let's create an organization that will just go out and tell the American people that we can do this, so all the things that people say they're concerned about concerning energy, throughput, and production can be solved with a crash program. 1974. If you go online right now and start looking up controlled thermonuclear fusion, you're going to see that the estimates are that fusion is 40 years away or 50 years away. It's always 40 or 50 years away. And it will always be 40 or 50 years away, so long as the people presently running either energy or security policy are allowed to do it. So we gave you, and here I only want to briefly refer to this, I think you've seen this, Lyndon LaRouche's 40-year record, A New International Economic Order. I think the only thing I really want to do at this point is point out something which might put some of you at ease about where you are and why we're talking to you in this way. And I think what that's going to be, I think I'll just refer to a friend of ours, some of us knew him very well, Fred Wills. This would be page 13. You could go to page 13. Those of you who've seen these, you have some? People have these? Okay, for people that don't have them, what we're looking at is Fred Wills, the former foreign minister of Guyana. And that's Fred addressing the United Nations. Now, Fred had been many things in Guyana, but what he did was he stood up and he made our proposal for international development banks at the United Nations at its session of September of 1976. 2 years later, Fred was in exile in New York City. Now, the reason that that happened to Fred is similar to something that happened to someone else. And for those of you who have this, if you go to page 17, LaRouche meets with President of Mexico, Lopez Portillo, in Mexico City. Okay, so LaRouche had a meeting. It was in May 27, 1982. After that meeting, he wrote a policy for the President of Mexico called Operation Juarez. The President of Mexico, in August of 1982, nationalized the currency of Mexico following LaRouche's proposals to him in Operation Juarez, and then he spoke at the United Nations. He received not the same treatment as Fred Wills, but in one sense it was unnecessary because he was at the end, or near the end, of a presidential term. And so later, much later, he, and this I believe is on page, I'm trying to find this, the last reference here. In a conference with Helga LaRouche. Excuse me, I just have to find.
35.
That's on page 35, yeah. I want to just refer here. Lopez Portillo, much older, in 1998. In other words, a full 16 years after his earlier actions, at a press conference in Mexico City, said, "It is now necessary for the world to listen to the wise words of Lyndon LaRouche." There's more to this story. As I said, I don't want to have everybody looking at things all the time, but I wanted you to refer you to this because this document, which is now in circulation in general by us, is going to go a long way, we hope, to calming people down enough to realize that at least somebody, an organization, and many people who will work listening to this organization, has had the ability to know what policy had to be, and to implement that policy. The last reference, I'm sorry, will be to someone by the name of Sergei Glaziev. Before we go to Sergei Glaziev, back on that last page you were just looking at, page 35, 1998 says, President Bill Clinton calls for a new financial architecture. I'll just read this to people because it's easy to follow. On September 14, 1998, immediately after returning from a state visit to Russia, President Clinton delivered a major address to the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City, in which he calls for, quote, a new financial architecture for the 21st century. If you then go to page 42, and then we'll be finished, Sergei Glaziev issues call for a new world financial architecture. Let me explain who this is. Sergei Glaziev is presently the special economic advisor to Vladimir Putin. At the time that he did this, he was running for president of Russia, and we had published a book of his called Genocide, Russia and the New World Order. The reason that we had that relationship to him was that he was assigned in the 1980s and early 90s when Lyndon LaRouche was in jail to study LaRouche's economics by an institute, a think tank in Russia. And over the course of time, became one of the closer collaborators for Lyndon LaRouche. Okay, he says, this is 2004, 10 years ago, the key priority today in world politics, where Russia could take the lead, is the formation of a new world financial architecture. Now the reason for that formulation, so people, just to say, is because in 1997, when Hillary Clinton, in, I believe it was February of that year, got up at the Davos conference, or Davos conference as it's sometimes called, and tried to call for a new Bretton Woods system, which was the precise formulation that was being used by Helga LaRouche in January of that year. She almost didn't leave alive. And so what happened was she just dropped that out. They never referred to the idea of a new Bretton Woods system again. Bretton Woods was where the United States built its Bretton Woods, New Hampshire financial and monetary system after the war. And that was the system that was maintained all over the world from 1944 to 1971. Nixon ended it in 1971 on August 15th. So the place where the meeting happened was called Bretton Woods. So people would refer to the monetary system that was established at the end of the Second World War as the Bretton Woods system. So when Hillary Clinton tried to sort of Photoshop in Lyndon LaRouche and Helga LaRouche at that conference, she never forgot it by promptly forgetting it forever. so to speak. She made sure she never made that mistake again. Bill Clinton, who is not the same thing as Hillary Clinton, and who is recalcitrant on these kind of matters, continued to advocate elements of LaRouche's policy, and he referred to it as a new financial architecture, which is the term that he and the Russians, and some people in Japan also, became conversant with and comfortable with in 1998. And so sometimes it reemerges. And when you hear it, it's our policy, usually. Now, okay, now that's sort of just an establishment shot to sort of set up where we are now. Because the question is, what's happening to us right now? Why is this meeting important? Why is there something that you're able to now do that you weren't able to do before this past week? Because that is now the case. As I think everybody here should be aware, if you are not, I guess I should refer to this. We of the Schiller Institute, LaRouche's associates, and so forth, have a view of the current President of the United States. We don't believe, well, I'll put it a little bit differently. Speaking individually, I am not, to this day, philosophically satisfied that the President of the United States exists. That's speaking personally. I've been saying this ever since January of 2008, when I was first asked about it in a meeting of our organization. People say, well, what do I think about Barack Obama? I said, well, I have philosophical doubts about his existence. And I'm not talking about his birth certificate. I'm talking about every time I hear him, I'm trying to figure out, does this person exist? Because I never hear anything from Barack Obama that I can correlate with an actual sentiment thought by Barack Obama. I hear words. I hear phrases. I can even sometimes hear paragraphs from him. But I never know whether in any way any of that has any meaning to him. And I don't believe that that has anything to do with any personal animosity or anything else toward this individual. I just have not to this day concluded whether he actually exists. There's another reason for that, which is when I look at the policies of Cheney and Bush, and I look at the policies of Obama, I see identity. You may not see it. I see identity. There's this very specific area of identity. It's called the problem of the unitary executive. Now, the unitary executive refers to something that some people call the imperial presidency. That's another term for it. That from the period, in particular, of well, you could go back to Nixon 40 years ago, if one wished to. That's kind of a different discussion, which we'll go back to for people who might be interested. But I'd like to take it from March of 1981, when Ronald Reagan got shot. People forget often that Ronald Reagan was nearly assassinated. And many people don't know that Ronald Reagan detested George Herbert Walker Bush. You'd have to go back to the campaign of 1980 for the presidency to know that. But that is the case. He was caused to take him under the ticket in the same way that these compromises have been made many times in American history. One of the most famous, for example, is the compromise in 1944, going back 70 years, which was done by Franklin Roosevelt in dumping his Vice President Henry Wallace, who would never have dropped the atomic bomb on Japan. Roosevelt was forced to take on Harry Truman. Then Roosevelt died, and Truman dropped the only 2 bombs he had. Had he had 5, he would have dropped 5. But he only had 2. And from that time, with the dropping of the atomic bomb, which would never have occurred had Henry Wallace been vice president, something called the American security state has been there. You see, every time after a war in American history, including World War I, that the United States armed itself as a nation, it always demobilized afterwards. But after the Second World War, The United States couldn't do it. Because you now had a technology so lethal, so dangerous, that if someone else who might be so absolutely insane as to use the bomb or to acquire the bomb, well then, how could you possibly defend the United States? So, when Eisenhower was warning about the military-industrial complex of the United States at the time that he gave his last speech in 1960, his farewell speech, what he was talking about was something that was completely new and had only existed for a period of approximately 15 years, and which he already saw was a runaway train, which was ultimately going to consume as much of the American economy as the Cold War economy of Russia was consumed. Right now, today, 62% of all American production that's left and budgetary matters are all intertwined with the military. And when you reach that point, there is no way that that society can survive that. No one can survive that, and America cannot survive that. Okay, so, the unitary executive. Let me say something about that here, and we come back to Obama and his friends in a moment. This is from Dick Cheney. This is from Dick Cheney of June of this year. Some of you know that there's a reason for bringing this up to you, which is that last Sunday, Dick Cheney had done an interview with this individual, William Crystal. And what he said was, quote, "We're in a very dangerous period, and I think that it is more threatening than the period before 9/11. I think 9/11 will turn out to be not nearly as bad as the next mass casualty attack against the United States, which, if and when it comes, will be with something far deadlier than with airplane tickets." Okay, now in June of this year, he gave an interview to a man by the name of Hugh Hewitt. You can find these, just look on just Google it. June 24th, Dick Cheney. Here's what he had to say. I'll give you the question and then answer. Question is Hewitt, answer is Cheney. Question, do you think we get through this decade without a massive attack on the homeland? Notice we're 4 years into this decade. Do we think we get through this decade without a massive attack on the homeland? Question. Answer. I doubt it. I doubt it. I think there will be another attack. And next time, I think it's likely to be far deadlier than the last one. You can just imagine what would happen. And then the questioner says, yeah. And then Cheney says, this is Cheney now, if somebody could smuggle a nuclear device, put it in a shipping container, and drive it down the Beltway outside of Washington, D.C. Question. And do you, by the way, if that were to happen, do you see the government reconstituting? Because it would have to be military rule for a period of time at least. Answer. Well, there was some years ago a program called the Continuity of Government Program. It was part of the Cold War strategy that we pursued. And basically it involved having a government waiting, if you will, ready to go in the event of a nuclear attack on the United States, so that we could always maintain the constitutional base of governmental authority. I was part of that program for several years, and a lot of it, I'm sure, is probably still classified. But it was very, very important, and we operated and actually trained under circumstances of how we would go about providing for a government to survive. If you know, we're having nuclear weapons from the Soviet Union dropped all over our country. June. Now, for purposes of just of disclosure, we should tell you that we first became aware of the Continuity in Government program in 1988. The reason we became aware of it is because Lyndon LaRouche was put on trial, as many of you know. And if you don't know, he was, and he was convicted. And he was put on trial and convicted in Alexandria, Virginia. Now, he was put on trial earlier in Boston, Massachusetts, where he was not acquitted, but that the jury there was dismissed. What happened in that trial, we'll come to continuity of government in a moment here, is we got a document from the safe of Oliver North. Some of you know who Oliver North was. He was involved in something called Iran-Contra. It was a super secret program under George Bush, which was arming the Contras in Nicaragua, and it was supposedly had a deal with Iran, okay, where they were basically getting weapons, and they were doing sort of weapons for money deals. The idea was also to do something around, in the aftermath of what happened with the hostages that were taken back in 1979-80, that this was another part of the deal. So that Iran was being actually equipped with weapons by the United States in the early 1980s, as the United States was also equipping Saddam Hussein with a total of what was $80 billion worth of weapons, which Rumsfeld knew all about. That's why Rumsfeld was saying that they had chemical weapons, because he sold them to them. So that's what we had. This is a real mess. Anyway, so we become aware of this because we get a document from Oliver North's safe, and it says, our man here says he has information on LaRouche. Let's see how the polygraph test goes. And it was an exchange between Oliver North and a guy named Lieutenant General Richard Secord. He'll become important in this overall narrative in a moment. When this came out at our trial in Boston, where they were trying to say we were thieves, we were stealing money from people, what happened was the trial shut down, and the jury was not allowed to actually deliberate. They decided on their own that the day they were being dismissed, they would just take an unbinding, non-binding vote. How would they have voted if it had been left to them to vote in the trial? And they all voted that we would have been not guilty. And they had not ever heard our case. We never got a chance to put our case on. They only heard the government case. Okay, that was in June of 1988. But a new case was started against us in Alexandria, Virginia, in the October of 1988. Here's why this is important. Alexandria, Virginia is the bedroom of Central Intelligence Agency, Defense Intelligence Agency, Department of Defense, the Pentagon, Mount Weather is there. That's where they do all the secret communication, so forth and so on. That's what it is. That's the area of Virginia where everybody who's an intelligence agent or the government operative works. When our jury was formed, after all of the challenges we made to the people that were our jury, the person that became the foreman of our jury was a guy named Buster Horton. That means that's the person that basically runs the jury. Buster Horton, we had to look him up. We wanted to see who he was. And what we found out was that Buster Horton was part of continuity in government. We still didn't know what it was. So we started investigating it, and continuity in government was a secret government of 100 individuals who are not the members of the Congress or the Senate, who are each deployed into some department of government in the United States, like the Department of Agriculture or the Department of Interior, so forth and so on. And what they're supposed to do is they are supposed to maintain continuity in a situation in which the Congress and the President are incapacitated. So Dick Cheney brought this up 5 months ago in this interview with this reporter, Hugh Hewitt, stating that under conditions that a nuclear weapon were detonated, just because it got smuggled and it got somehow in a container and somebody just blew it up on 495, the Beltway, that under that circumstance, continuity in government would go into effect. Okay. Now the reason for telling you that is not to scare you, though it might be useful if you were afraid, but to tell you something about where we are in the United States and where we are vis-a-vis the issue of what we're actually looking at. Now we're going to take a look at that, and then I'll conclude, not because there's not a lot of other good things to say or important things to say, but because I want to now sort of shift over to saying something about Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Meanwhile, back in humanity, What's actually been happening is that a whole set of people, half of the world's population, has decided that it will go in a different direction. And this different direction is one of development, of progress, and of cooperation. And they want the United States in this. But they don't really quite exactly know how to do that. Because they keep getting back some one or other form of insanity, no matter virtually how they approach the United States. I think people here have some idea of what we've said about this, but just so I'm clear, I just refer, you don't have to pick this up, I just want to tell you that the Brics summit that occurred in Brazil created, it was called the Fortaleza Declaration, 72 points, and they announced the formation of a new development bank, which capitalized at $50 billion, and also a contingent reserve arrangement, $100 billion. Now, why this is important is, and I didn't stop to go through the International Development Bank, but if you were to look at that proposal I told you that Linda LaRouche wrote back in 1975, April, you'll see that the design that they have for this bank is not identical to what we wrote. No, because it's 40 years later. So of course it's not going to be identical. It shouldn't be identical. But it is in principle the same conception. Now this is not because, Linda LaRouche is just a genius and he had these ideas. No, what actually happened was we were involved in a series of discussions, of discourses with various people through the 70s and 80s who decided that what we were talking about was right and it was doable. Also, many had elements of these ideas themselves. They already were pursuing these policies in some respect. For example, that was true in China during the 1990s, where we were instrumental in organizing a conference called, and you may have said this before, the Eurasian Land Bridge, the New Silk Road, locomotive for worldwide economic development. This was a conference that it took us 3 years to organize in Beijing. We organized the whole conference. We weren't alone in organizing it. You can't do that in China. But the point is, it was our idea, it was our initiative, and we carried it out. And the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which some of you have heard of, came out of that conference. Now, these countries, representing half of humanity, have decided that they are going to adopt, actually, what would be known as, and what would be properly called, the American system. But the American system is a very particular term that only refers to the economic ideas, basically, of the following people or their associates. Alexander Hamilton, not Adam Smith. A man but you've probably not ever heard of by the name of Matthew Carey, C-A-R-E-Y, Irish, an associate of Ben Franklin. His son, Henry Charles Carey, who was Abraham Lincoln's economic advisor. The U.S. Senator Henry Clay, who's a well-known person in the United States from the 19th century. And then a series of additional people. Friedrich List of Germany, who's also an American, he operated out of Reading, Pennsylvania. He created basically the designs for transcontinental railway systems. John Quincy Adams, formerly both President of the United States and Secretary of State of the United States under Monroe. And then a few people that come after that that are associated with these people. Erasmus Peshine Smith is one individual, Horton Barker is another. Now if you walk into any American university and name any of these people, they'll just look at you. What? Maybe Hamilton, but then they're going to say something about Hamilton that actually is completely different than what I'm about to refer to. What this was the following. The American Revolution was not concluded until Alexander Hamilton wrote his 4 documents on economy, and he established the United States in embryo as what would become the most powerful economy in the world. Not a well-known fact, but this is what actually happened. He wrote about creation of a national bank. He wrote about what's called public credit. He wrote a paper on manufacturing called Report on Manufactures. Okay? And then he wrote a paper on the constitutionality of the National Bank. Now, why these are so important, and we can take this up in questions and answers rather than me sort of blabber about it now to everybody. Because some of you may have more interest than others, and we'll see how things go. But why this is important is, this was the most revolutionary thing ever done in the world in economics, including Karl Marx, who compared to Alexander Hamilton, was a total reactionary. Now, this is not well known, because the manufacturing side of what Hamilton was doing was never really appreciated as being sort of the driver of what they were actually doing. See, what they were trying to do was transition from a plantation economy to a manufacturing economy. And that was their notion of how they were going to evolve out of the slave economies. There were some like John Adams and Hamilton who simply opposed slavery. They were founders of the United States. But then there were those like Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson that supported slavery. And they were also founders of the United States. So when the United States was formed, there's all kinds of people sitting at the table who have decided, listen, we don't necessarily approve of one another, but what we're going to do here is we are unifying against Britain because we believe the following. We say that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any government becomes destructive of those ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations upon such principles and organizing itself in such form as to them shall seem best to guarantee their safety and happiness. Then it goes on to say a little bit later, and that's where we are, in my humble opinion, in America today. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations evinces the desire to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government. That's the Declaration of Independence. That's what it says. It is your duty to throw off such government and to institute new guards for their security. Now, the reason you see that the United States, therefore, could be co-opted into the Brics process, coming back for a moment to Hamilton, is that there's a revolutionary principle that defines the United States as an action, not a place. The United States is an action, not a place. It has a principle, it's a principled action, but it's an action nonetheless. The action is revolution. But on behalf of what? Now, here we come to looking at Vladimir Putin, for example, or let's take Christina Kirchner, because that's even a better example, because Nestor Kirchner and Christina Kirchner regularly discussed, and still to some degree discuss, Franklin Roosevelt as their model for everything that they're doing right now on economics in Argentina. It was Vladimir Putin that had made sure over 100 ceremonies celebrating, I think it was the 175th anniversary of the birth of Franklin Roosevelt. He did that in Russia. There was no such thing in America. Yeah. This is what we're talking about here. See, so the American system is there. The British system is what you have in America. You see, because why? What happens is, whom the gods would destroy, they first make men. And the first thing that happens is, now you can't any longer recognize yourself. It's sort of like the real way to understand what Michael Jackson meant by, I'm looking for the man in the mirror. And that's problem. Seriously, but that's the problem with America. Now, I'm not telling you that this is something that can't be done, but I want to make it something very clear. Let's take a look at, for example, what we've just been told we ought to believe about what's happened with Ebola in America. Okay? I'm not saying it's a hoax or anything, but just look at what we're being told we have to believe. We're supposed to believe that a man from Liberia who had the decency to try to take care of some individuals who were sick, recognizing what that danger was to himself, got on a plane, got to Texas, and said, I don't feel too good, I'm going to the hospital. Got there, they told him to go home, he went home. Then he came back several days later, they said, oh, look at that, he's got Ebola. Then we're told that the nurses take care of him, others take care of him, and one of the nurses is so lax, apparently, because she didn't think she could get it, that she contracts the disease, even though she says she was completely covered. Then we're told that a second nurse, who calls the CDC and says, I'm not feeling so good, I'm getting ready to get on a plane, is that okay? They said, sure, no problem. Okay, now, if this is true, it's worse than if it isn't. I mean, in other words, it would be better if Ebola were said to be a weapon, a biological weapon. You realize we're in better shape? Because at least we have a vaccine antidote. Because no so-called biological weapon is developed that doesn't have an antidote. You realize if it's not that, what our situation is, especially when you look at these morons? Now, in other words, that's if you accept the narrative. That's why I did that to you. I'm not telling you that that's all true. I'm telling you that's what you're being told you are to believe about what occurred. Now it's possible that that occurred. What does it mean about the people who would be part of that scenario? They're delusional, is what it means. There's a part of the Mask of the Red Death that I don't have memorized, but I'll just try to do what I can. It was after that the seizure, progress, and termination of the disease with the incidence of half an hour, says, but the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to himself 1,000 of his hale and light-hearted friends and retired with them to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. And he goes on to describe, right? This was a lofty and magnificent structure, the product of the prince's eccentric yet august taste. And it goes on, and you get the idea of what happens if they all go out there. It says that the strong and lofty wall girdled it in. They get there, and they bring furnaces and massy hammers, and they bolt this so that no one can leave. It said they did not want to yield to frenzy or despair from within. And it said that the world, that they could bid defiance to contagion. Oh, that's the important one. They could bid defiance to contagion. Now, those of you who know the story know what happens. The rest of you can imagine what happens. And this Halloween, I understand, although I don't know what will happen. One of the popular masks is supposed to be an Ebola mask. I don't know if somebody is actually going to do that. But it's important to recognize what kind of disconnect you're dealing with. It's like during the period of the bubonic plague, 14th century, when people began this thing called the St. Vitus dance, and you dance yourself to death, which is partially where this term, the dance of death, comes from. It's a frenzy. Somehow you see this in American churches and some of the, you see this kind of stuff too. It's related, not necessarily the same. I'm not attacking anybody's religious beliefs. I'm just saying it's a similar phenomenon. Let's come back, though, to the Brics process for a minute, because what's actually happened? You have India, which launches satellites to Mars. First country in history to do it successfully on the first try. You have China, which is mining the moon, wants to mine the moon for helium-3 to use in thermonuclear fusion. You have Russia, of course, which has been in space as long as the United States, in fact, longer than the United States. As in the case of Sputnik, for example, and the first astronauts. You have Argentina, which has launched now its first satellite, in collaboration with the Europeans and others. So, there's another possibility, and this will be my conclusion, and then we'll come to questions. You know, the first time when the astronauts went to the moon, I think it was the mission just before, I think it was actually the Apollo mission before the moon one. They took these pictures of Earth. Some of you may know this is a sort of famous story in the counterculture, that when Stuart Brand saw the picture of the Earth, the so-called big blue marble, that he was inspired to create what he called the Whole Earth Catalog, where the concept was, hey, it's one planet. We're all here. It's beautiful. We need to work together on the planet to secure not only our survival, but our prosperity. And people like Buckminster Fuller and others talked about this all the time back then. And I'm bringing this up because, though you may hear, including from our organization, a lot of things about people from the 60s we denounced because many of us knew these people, we didn't like them at the time. Actually, the truth is, whatever we may think, sort of like the Declaration of Independence idea, it's not necessary for everybody to agree on everything, to do certain things that are essential. And when it comes to humanity, food, clothing, health, shelter, education, these are things that are the birthright of every person. Why? Because nobody who was born determined that they were going to be born. Now they showed up. You're really going to like deprive that person of that? A child of that? They didn't make the decision. When they're here, what do? That's one of the big fights we often have with people who talk about right to life, because they seem to be fine about that in terms of conception. Now, I have no problem with what they say. But the problem is that after the kid's born, they're gone. What about all that? What about the next, 21 years? You just, somehow opted out of that. Now, you need to moonwalk away from that problem. And you're just happy that a baby was born. See, this is not the idea. There has to be a conception of a humanity acting as adults that are going to address problems of the type that seem to now be confronting us right now in West Africa. So, on that problem, we may be dealing with something that is as deadly as what Edgar Poe wrote in The Mask of the Red Death. And if that's the case, then we are already way, way, way behind. If it's not the case, we should act as though it is. Why? By acting as though it were the case, and by marshaling the forces of the planet to address that, we may be able to return sanity to the planet as a whole, especially by attempting to incorporate insane or nearly insane nations, such as what we're right now seeing in the case of the United States executive and others, into that design. This is what we need to do, and I believe that this is possible, and that this creates a new international financial, economic, and security architecture that we could all be both proud of and leave to the generations behind us that follow as an actual hope for a future that they might be able to actually wish to live in and be proud to live in. So I'm going to conclude there, and at some point, Bob, I'm going to want you to say a few things to underscore a point that I made in the course of this, but I'd like to stop there and see if we have any questions. That the eugenic problem is examined with the greatest care, and that the public mind is informed of the issues at stake, so that much that now is unthinkable may at least become thinkable. It's 1946. Why is that significant? Well, for many reasons, which also have to do with the counterculture of the 1960s, which we will not take a long time to digress into here, because we're only going to basically create a sort of establishment presentation, and then at the point that you're ready to ask questions, we'll go into that. In 1974, Helga LaRouche intervened at a conference, a United Nations conference, on world population. This happened in Bucharest, Romania. There's a paragraph I'd like to refer to, which was written by the person who at that time was heading the American Association for the Advancement of Science and was at that conference. This person stated, at Bucharest it was affirmed that continuing unrestricted worldwide population growth can negate any socio-economic gains and fatally imperil the environment. The earlier extreme views that social and economic justice alone can somehow offset population increase, and that the mere provision of contraception can sufficiently reduce population were defeated. Go back to this. The earlier extreme views that social and economic justice copies, which we'll be referring to, of that magazine as we go along. And it's important to say something about the actuality of what is happening in West Africa, which you can't know unless you know what was happening 40 years ago. What is being represented to you as occurring as though it were some sort of inevitable occurrence is an occurrence by design, by intention, and with malice. Malice aforethought. I want to refer here, for people to sort of just know, to a couple of individuals, one of whom you may be more familiar with, his brother, Julian Huxley. Julian Huxley, whose brother was Aldous Huxley, who's an author, both of them British, was the founder and the creator, actually, of the United Nations Educational, Social, and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO. It's not well known that between the years 1937 and 1944, note the years, he was also the head of the British Eugenics Society. He stated in 1946, quote, "Even though it is quite true that radical eugenic policy will be for many years politically and psychologically impossible, it will be important for UNESCO to see well, it would be good to hear a little from a person who can't be here. He was an American intelligence operative by the name of Edgar Poe, sometimes mistakenly referred to as Edgar Allan Poe. He wrote a story called The Mask of the Red Death, or The Masquerade of the Red Death. And that story begins by his saying, "The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal. The redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness. And then the person experienced dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body and especially upon the face of the victor were the pest band that shut him out from the aid and the sympathy of his fellow men. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour." we're told something about something alone can somehow offset population increase. What she's referring to is an intervention made at that conference by Helga against her, that being Margaret Mead, the famous anthropologist Margaret Mead, who was at that time the president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and against whom we directed almost our entire force of intervention, not because of her, but because of what was actually being discussed at that conference. Now, to understand the year 1974, it's important to understand a few things that were going on at that time. There was a man by the name of Robert McNamara. He had become very famous, or infamous, particularly here in Canada, as well as in the United States, because of the Vietnam War. And back in that time, for those of you that might go back that far, you may remember that Montreal in particular, also Toronto, were meccas for, some might say Medinas for, draft dodgers, people from the United States who were either conscientious objectors or whatever, and they were up here. And I know because I was up here at one point, not because I was dodging the draft, because of my own interest in, shall we say, all things countercultural back in 1970-71. Robert McNamara was a term you used to more or less describe the same thing that today you think about as with Dick Cheney. You know, you use the word Dick Cheney, everybody knows what you mean. It's almost a term itself that expresses a certain sort of sociopath. So Robert McNamara was the correlate going on in West Africa. It's referred to as an Ebola virus. It's not news to people who've been following these sorts of things for many, many years. Since 1976, its virulence and its fatality and its finality and its hideousness and its horror has been known. Since 2000, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States has written about the fact that they were aware that between 1973 and 2000, over 30 new diseases had emerged in the world that they thought that the United States had to have a concern about. Their report, just a quote from it, January 2000, stated, at least 30 previously unknown disease agents have been identified since 1973, including HIV, Ebola, hepatitis C, and Nipah virus, for which no cures are available. That's a quote from their report. Now, Matthew unintentionally but accurately stated that I had been a founding member of the Schiller Institute for 40 years. Now, the Schiller Institute has only existed for 30, but that's actually an accurate statement. The reason it's accurate is that 10 years earlier, in 1974, the Executive Intelligence Review magazine was born. We've given you some